John Nero here, back again, continuing this series on good learning based on the book A Mind for Numbers using the software MindNode. Feel free to check it out. It's available in the App Store. I don't know if I mentioned that in previous videos, but yeah, it's the way I structure conceptually, how I approach learning books or anything. So I find it really useful. So moving on, so practicing is our next branch we have here. We talked about chunking your problem in the previous video. We talked about focusing intently, the Pomodoro technique, and the flow state, right? And then chunking, we talked about forming a chunk and how to make it powerful. Perfect. So now practicing, this should be a shorter video here. Let's see what we have here. I'm going to enter focus mode. So practice helps build and reinforce strong neural patterns, conceptual chunks of understanding. Make studying a habit. Find a workplace and block off times. Using Google Calendar, or if you have a paper-based agenda, that's really helpful. Really try to find days where you know you won't be called or pulled away. That is awesome. Going to a coffee shop, making a ritual out of that. Find a place where you're really comfortable to study. Maybe it's not in your apartment or your home. Maybe you have pets and families and that interrupt you. If you can find a nice sort of almost a sanctuary for you to study, it really helps learning and it helps productivity. So persistence is key. Attention should be on building process habits that coincidentally allow you to do the unpleasant tasks that need to be done. Okay. So incremental progress is really important thing in learning anything. Okay, not having this mindset where you're expecting these amazing advances in one day. No, it's too grandiose. Set yourself small goals and then pursue them diligently and consistently. Oftentimes mastery is done, often achieved in years, oftentimes decades too. Okay, so don't expect grand things to be done within weeks. Okay, this takes time. All right, and don't beat yourself up too. Okay. So let's move on. Okay, practicing. What is that? Use recall. Attempting to recall the material you are trying to learn. Oh, this is awesome. The retrieval practice. This will enhance deep learning and helps us begin forming chunks. So, how does this look like? When you're reading a book, when you're reading a textbook, when you're studying from PowerPoints or what have you, close the book, close the PowerPoint program, and just explain what you just learned. Do it without looking at the material. This is how you recall, okay? This is so important. This is not talked about enough. I find it, probably if you're going to get anything out of this series, recall, this retrieval practice is so important to learning, okay? I know I'm belaboring the point, but it's what I feel like I attribute it to me learning a lot of what I know is closing a book and just talking about what I just saw. We talked briefly about how explaining things to yourself, teaching is the best way to learn, right? You're incorporating and assimilating that outside external information into your own model of the world, okay? And it's sort of accommodating outside information into your model and your paradigm and how you see the world. That is the best way to learn. So recall is really just the impetus to learning, I think. Never highlight anything you haven't put in your mind first by recalling. There's this pathology in students I see is they'll highlight everything. And you open this book up and it's just yellow lines and you can hardly see any just plain text. I understand that. I would do that a bunch of times, but I find that if you ever, like this says, only highlight the things that you can almost even recite through memory. You want to highlight key principles, things that are absolutely pertinent, okay? Replace highlighting with active recall if you can, okay? Moving on, thinking mnemonically. What does that mean? Learning to process ideas visually in math and science is a powerful way to become a master of the material. Use childlike creativity. So this branch breaks out of other branches. Let's see what we have here. Okay. Oh, Interesting. So we're going to learn about what that exactly means. So make it multisensory. The more vivid the image, the more likely it is to cleave to its locus. We'll flesh this out a bit when we finish reading. It is used most effectively when you recall the image with multiple senses. The more associative hooks a new piece of info has, the more securely it gets embedded into the network of things you already know, and the more likely it is to retain in memory. So let's translate this to English. Okay. So we have practicing, and we think mnemonically. So what does this mean exactly? So whenever you're learning, let's say we're learning something about, I don't know, the history of art, or how about this? Something I'm biased towards is anatomy or physiology. If you're trying to learn about the function of the liver, if you can just imagine, close your eyes and imagine the liver. One of the functions of the liver is to clear out toxins. If you can just close your eyes, if you really want to remember that, if you close your eyes and imagine the liver, right, and we think of clearing out toxins, try to form an image of that. What exactly does that look like to you? If you can imagine the liver as some sort of like, I don't know, maybe a net. If you can imagine the liver as some sort of net, like a fish net that catches things, and you can imagine sort of toxins as little tennis balls, and these tennis balls try to go through the liver, but they're caught by the liver, and maybe the liver sort of catches these tennis balls. If you can imagine the liver just as even a butterfly net. See, so you can see what I'm doing here is just making it absurd. The more imaginative you are in learning something, the more likely it is to be remembered. And what I mean by multisensory is, we talked about in another video, we talked about how you could close your eyes and imagine an apple. How about, whenever you close your eyes and you imagine this hypothetical, this sort of mental image, imagine you holding this net, and in the net is shaped as a liver, and if you can feel the net in your hand, and you can see these tennis balls, and perhaps there's a certain scent. You're in a grassy terrain, and you can smell the dew in the grass, and maybe you can actually hear the sound of the wind as you're catching these tennis balls that represent toxins. Maybe these tennis balls are colored differently, like purple, which is closely related to a toxin, right? So the more creative you are, the more likely you are to remember that. So that's what I mean by multisensory. Really closing your eyes and imagining these things. Imagine them. Not just glossing over them and saying, oh, okay, I can think of and that's silly. I'm sure I can think of a net. No. Just close your eyes and really be there and bring in all the senses. The more senses, the better. Make it dirty and crude. Okay, so let's see what I have here. The funnier, lewder, and more bizarre, the better. Your brain captures anomalies really well. Things like that are pretty anomalous, and the brain is also an emotional entity, right? An emotional organ, we'll say. And so it remembers bizarre things much, much easier. If you close your eyes and imagine an airplane, right, and you're in the cockpit of an airplane, and maybe the cockpit is shaped as, some sort of inappropriate genital, right? You can see where I'm going there. It's the hypersexual, the inappropriate things. Your brain remembers those things much more readily, and so we can use that to our advantage when learning material. When forming images, it helps to have a dirty mind. Evolution has programmed our brains to find two things particularly interesting: jokes and sex, especially jokes about sex. So what I'm saying here is just the more inappropriate, the more silly, crazy, outlandish, the easier it is to recall it, okay? Anthropomorphize your images. So if you're thinking of objects, if you're thinking of a cell, imagine a cell, right? You can maybe in your mind you're recalling images of a cell. You can see the nucleus, and maybe it's something from out of a textbook too, right? You see the nucleus, you see the Golgi body, and you can see the ribosomes, spattered all over the cell. But what if we make the cell growing legs? Well, this cell is walking, and this cell starts to grow arms as well. And you can see maybe you can imagine the cell having, depending on the cell, it can have a personality. Like we'll say an osteocyte, a bone cell, might have a rough, rigid personality. You can maybe imagine a kidney cell having sort of like a flamboyant personality, right? And so anthropomorphizing the things you learn really, because we deal in people, humans, and so if you can, the better you can anthropomorphize the things you're learning, the easier it can be to find these associational hooks, and the easier it is to remember them. Avoid abstract ideas and strive for concrete ones. If I ask you to imagine what multiplication is, that's much more difficult. But if I ask you to maybe try to find something less abstract, like for multiplication, you can close your eyes and think of, let's see, pick an animal, an elephant, for example, and you can see these elephants multiplying in numbers. That's what I'm sort of meaning, is just try to stick to concrete ideas if you can. The more concrete, the better. Our brain has trouble remembering abstract ideas. So the more concrete, the better. Okay, so that's thinking mnemonically. We'll go ahead and move on. Space your repetition. This is a cool tip here. I recommend an app. I'll just type it here. It's Anki. They're flashcards, and they use a software that sort of you're introduced a flashcard and you rate it by how easy it was to solve the flashcard. And the harder it is, the more immediate the flashcard will come again. But let's say it was super easy for you to remember the flashcard, then it'll space that the time it shows you. So maybe it'll show you in 2 days or the next day, right? And then they'll get progressively spaced out, and studies have shown that spaced repetition really solidifies memory, consolidation of short-term to long-term. So the technique involves repeating what you are trying to retain, like a vocab word, but spacing this repetition out over a number of days. Pretty straightforward. Feynman technique. You can Google Feynman technique. I won't go over this in depth, but it's basically just a way to tackle a problem or tackle a subject or tackle a concept, okay? And so it is right here. You're more than welcome to pause the video and just take a look here, but I'm going to go ahead and move on. Feynman technique, super helpful. Interleaving is a practice of mixing different kinds of problems requiring different strategies to help train the brain, not only how to solve the problems, but when to employ certain strategies for certain problems. Interleaving is sort of like cross-training. If you can think of a sprinter, right, who maybe cross-trains in swimming, you can see how there's some overlap into the benefits they both provide. Right? And so that's basically interleaving is mental cross-training is what it is. So if you're studying a particular concept in OChem, organic chemistry, or in calculus, you can move on to maybe physics, and you can see how calculus is applied to physics, or maybe you can see how organic chemistry is applied to physics. And you might think, well, how do those two pertain? Well, you can find, maybe the particular how atoms behave. Physics deals in the behavior of atoms, right? And what is organic chemistry dealing with? Molecules, and molecules are composed of atoms, of course. You can imagine that there are some conceptual overlaps between those two with seemingly disparate disciplines, okay? So that's interleaving, is going out, branching out into other domains and finding connections between those seemingly different domains, okay? And that's pretty much it for practicing. I'm going to stop the video here. Thanks again. I'm going to continue on with the series. In the next video, we will talk about taking breaks, right? And eventually, yeah, I think we'll go ahead and do one whole video on these three guys here in the next video. But thanks again for tuning in. Be sure to like, subscribe. If you find this helpful, recommend it to a friend. And that is all I have for y'all. So thanks again.